Hello and welcome to yet another Stratcom Talks, where we are exploring different aspects important to our strategic communications community. And we are now going deeper into specific areas of interest, and we are receiving also your comments about regions and research and aspects on strategic communications you would be interested in, and we are really thankful for your feedback. And to those who are watching this the first time, we invite you to listen to our speakers and send in your questions. Either you are watching on YouTube or you are watching on Facebook. We will be receiving your questions and giving them to our speakers. So today we are looking at countering violent extremism in North Africa and Sahel region. And we have two exciting speakers today. We have invited Dr. Pascal Carlocchi and Dr. Stefano Markuzzi. We are going to discuss a broad geographical area which is crucial for the security of the alliance. In fact, the safety of our home countries is linked to that of our neighbors. This is especially true in the case of North Africa and the Sahel, regions that for centuries have been exchanging with your people, ideas, and also goods. And terrorism is still a major reason for concern within our societies. Looking at the dynamics of terrorism in North Africa and the Sahel can inform us both directly and indirectly. Directly because the networked nature of international terrorism witnesses some major nodes in these regions. Indirectly because understanding North African and Sahelian issues in relation to terrorism can shed light on what can happen with our home countries or in other areas of interest to the alliance. The landscape in North Africa and Sahel is marked by a high degree of complexity. Terrorism does not exist in a vacuum, rather it fills the vacuum left by the disintegration or erosion of formal and informal institutions. Our experts today, Pascal Carlocchi and Stefano Markuzzi, will help us to understand what is the role of strategic communications in countering violent extremism in North Africa and Sahel. I would like to introduce you to our first speaker. It is Dr. Pascal Carlocchi. He is a lecturer of international relations at Coventry University. He is an expert in security and defense and has worked extensively in Europe and overseas, as well as on policy and operational level. He worked in Afghanistan and in Sahel in EU CSDP missions, and he also holds a PhD in war studies from King's College in London and an MA in EU international relations from the College of European. He's also one of the authors of our recent reports. He's the sole author of one of our reports, which is titled Stratcom in the Mediterranean and the Sahel. Dr. Carlucci, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for your kind introduction and an invitation. What I would like to talk to you today is strategic communication challenges in tackling violent extremism in the Sahel region. I will concentrate in particular on the tripartite region called Liptako-Gourma, which covers the border between Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. The strategic criticalities in addressing violent groups and networks in the region are mirrored in Stratcom matters. But more importantly, we need to address the elephant in the room, which is the long-term strategy in the region. By analyzing the situation, by pointing out key Stratcom issues, by defining long-term strategy, I'm hoping really to provide a solid ground for our discussion with the community of interest. When we refer to the Sahel, we are really talking about Western Sahel. Since 2014, 5 countries have been grouped together under a diplomatic initiative that became an organization called the G5 Sahel. These countries are Mauritania, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Chad. Such initiative is a regional effort for development and security. It has a military component, which is backed by France and a coalition made up of several countries, EU countries, US, UK, Gulf states, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. Geographically speaking, the Sahel is a strip of land that stretches from Eritrea to Senegal, and historically this land has been the setting for trade, exchanges, migration, trafficking, and slavery. This was the result of a difficult geography, desert, dry lands, and poor economy based on agriculture, livestock that was never sufficient for the population. The political history of these countries is characterized by colonial rule, dictatorship, fragile democracies, and difficult relation between central authorities and ethnic groups, the case of Tuareg, for example. In recent decades, the economy of these countries has been considerably influenced by mining activities like gold and uranium. Terrorism in the region is the result of this geopolitical setup. Historically speaking, terrorism in the region has evolved with different groups, networks, and labels, or tightly or less tightly linked to Al-Qaeda. The history of these groups suggests that terrorism in the region originates from Algeria, and then it develops into northern Mali. Formed around 2007, Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb is the result of a coalition of several overlapping networks led by leaders like Abu Zaid, Druktel, Mokhtar Belmokhtar, Iyad Ghali. AQIM was divided into several katibas, this is what they call these armed groups, which still today characterize the structure of currently active terrorist organizations. The uniqueness of terrorism in this region since the beginning has been its ability to combine the militant agenda with a more or less refined criminal strategy, which involved trafficking and kidnapping as a way of financing their activities. AQIM is also highly influenced by the presence of foreign fighters. The same Belmokhtar, who fought in Afghanistan and Algeria, is now missing since 2016. And this is the evidence that violent extremism in Sahel is the result of power dynamics and internal struggles of global jihadism. What prompted international attention was the alliance in 2012 between Ansar al-Din and an Al-Qaeda-linked group and MNLA, Mouvement National pour la Libération de l'Azawad, a Tuareg formation that launched an offensive against the Malian government to claim the northern part of the country. Now, many Tuaregs left Mali in 1990 after the civil war, and they joined Gaddafi's armies. When in 2011 Libya collapsed, these Tuaregs were in Libya, trained and equipped with Libyan weapons, returned to Mali to form this group. The Malian president requested international support to fight militants. So France launched Operation Serval. I have to stress that Operation Serval was also supported by a group of other countries, other European countries. So it was not merely a French effort. And they wanted to support the Malian government to stop Islamist advance to Bamako. So it was quite a precise military operation with a very clear task. Now, this intervention, and France decided to expand this military intervention into a regional effort of 5 countries in the region. This was the major shift in transforming what was at that moment the Malian problem into having an approach that was rather regional. And this was called the Operation Barkhane, 5,000 man mission to regionalize the efforts to fight against terrorism. And this led also to other deployments. For example, we have a very large UN mission in Mali, MINUSMA. We have EU missions, the EU Terrorism mission, UCAP in Mali and Niger, and several other bilateral missions. One of them is the Italian one in Niger. So moreover, the G5 Sahel has created its own military capabilities to fight militants in the region. And Euro-Korean countries will deploy the task force Takuba to support local forces. Now, terrorism has evolved since the war in Mali in 2013. And what we see today is two big military groups in the regions. One of them is JNIM, Jamaat al-Nasr al-Islam wal-Muslimin, and ISGS, Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. Now, JNIM is the continuation of AQAM, while ISGS is a splinter group that has pledged allegiance to the Islamic State. While in the past, the main focal point for military activities was northern Mali, the new area of concern now is the area I was talking about before, is the border between Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Now, JNIM and ISGS have initially cooperated, but recently they have started antagonizing each other and attacking each other. The fighting between the two groups has sectarian, communal, and ethnic violence dimension, which and these can exacerbate even further the security situation in the region. For example, some Pearls have been recruited into ISGS to seek the protection from raids and other ethnic group and violent activities. And this is something that I believe it's very important and we ought to look very deeply. As you can see from the map, JNIM represent a greater threat to Mali, while ISGS operates more in northern Burkina Faso and Niger. The type of attacks carried out are typically armed raids against the villages and security forces. A few weeks ago, we had a tragic attack, for example, in Niger, which costed the lives of 130 people. Now, Boko Haram and the instability around the Lake Chad region still continues to pose a serious security concern. But at present, the situation is much more contained than a few years ago. Now, having explored the galaxy of violent extremism in the Sahel, we can now draw some of the challenges of strategic communication in the region. The first challenge is one size doesn't fit all. We cannot apply the same strategy and tactics we have applied, for example, in conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan to the Sahel. We cannot do that. I would argue that each and every country in the Sahel needs its own approach to fight terrorism. This is, however, without prejudice to the overall aim of fighting terrorism in the regions. We see these connections between countries, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can adopt the same approach in each individual country. We have to be, of course, more sophisticated than that. Now we have seen how these groups were quickly established and transformed to more or less to reflect, to adhere to local struggles and power dynamics. So our first concern should be to acknowledge these local struggles and try to divorce them from the Islamist narrative. This is a critical issue. The second challenge in Stratcom issues is to address radicalization. There are several models that describe the process by which an individual becomes radicalized. One of them was developed, for example, by NYPD. I believe we have to start about how individuals interpret their personal situation and how they are informed about what's going on around them. And that terrorists, and then the second message I think we need to develop is that terrorists do not protect populations. Secondly, we must make sure that populations who happen to suffer from terrorist attacks and raids are taken care of and not abandoned. Thirdly, we should disrupt by all means possible, including communication, any organization trying to indoctrinate people, whether they be places of cult or other organizations. Lastly, we need to communicate clearly that those who join terrorist organizations can leave these organizations and collaborate with authorities. This can have a devastating effect on terrorist organizations, and we have seen this, for example, in the case of Boko Haram. The third challenge is to understand which media is more effective in that part of the world. I believe the radio station play a pivotal role in the fight against terrorism, especially in the Sahel. Engaging local radios in the immediate aftermath, for example, of an attack can help reduce the spread of false information, and more quickly actually than in the news and social media. For example, one thing that we have to look for is the ratio of availability of mobile phone, and therefore some sort of internet connection with regards and pair it with the radio stations. For example, the ratio of connection in this country is 40.6 per 100 inhabitants in Niger, for example. So we have 40 phone contracts per 100 inhabitants. A country like Italy, for example, has 133. Now, Mali is doing, it has a lot more connection per 100 inhabitants. The number of radio stations in countries like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are a lot. If you consider just in Niger, you have 30 private radio stations that can operate locally, and as many as 100 community radio stations. So imagine the impact that a good Stratcom strategy can have on if you address the messaging delivered by these radios and radio stations. The first challenge is the narrative, both visual and verbal, of interventionism. Too often I see the parallelism between Afghanistan, Iraq, and the Sahel. If one reads a newspaper article, for example, about the Sahel, they're likely to see pictures of soldiers, and those pictures resemble pretty much those we have seen in Afghanistan. And I say because I worked in both countries. We live in a different historical moment, and interventionism is not particularly welcome in public opinion these days, especially for the fatigue of large and long deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. So the presence of the international troops should be solely interpreted as a support element. The media strategy around it should reflect that, and unfortunately, I don't see that very often. My last point, and perhaps the most important point, is to address the elephant in the room, which is our long strategy in the Sahel. The region cannot be a temporary engagement. As we have seen at the peak of the migration crisis, this region cannot be ignored in the hopes that its trouble will somehow go away. Whatever happens here will have an effect in the North Africa and the Mediterranean and Europe. It is a crossroads of migration and trafficking routes. It has critical mineral resources such as gold and uranium. Moreover, China and Russia are increasingly gaining important presence and launching a competition on influence in the regions. And we should not overlook that. So in light of Stratcom challenges, I think we need to ask ourselves, what is our ultimate political objective in the region? We are now addressing a global crisis caused by COVID-19 pandemic, which has affected nearly all aspects of our life. Politicians and experts are thinking how areas like Sahel will become an opportunity for investment, and they should think about it in these terms rather than simply narrow it down to security concern. The countries we mentioned today have a young population that could gain immensely from new opportunities in their countries. We therefore need to consider how military deployments and security initiatives in the regions help to contribute to this long-term goal. Strategic communication will make sure that military involvement in the region is well understood and can eradicate causes of violent extremism. I see strategic communication as an essential auxiliary to an overall political strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascal. you have been looking at this region for quite a while, and you already expressed your ideas about the future strategic communications challenges and the players that we see in the region. But if if I would ask you to be a visionary for a bit and think about G5 Sahel region in the future of, let's say, 5 years, and we've seen really how different policy activities within the region and also, of course, outside of the region have changed due to the COVID-19 crisis. We've seen China and Russia growing interest and growing their influence. We've seen vaccine diplomacy happening in this region and in other global regions as well. So what would be your take on the future in the next 5 years? We don't hear you.
I think I think it all depends on the security situation on the ground. If we can strike a decisive blow on terrorist organization in the region, I think that will help. But I think what helps is developing a global economic strategy that takes Sahel into consideration and see how Sahel can become really an actor in our global effort to recover the economy. I think that's a winning move. In that sense, everything will fall into place. So 5 years, as you rightly pointed out, is the ideal time for us now to think about how we could fit in everything that we are doing in the Sahel in 5-year term, but I also think longer, because the longer you think, the better.
Thank you, Pascal. I think it's time for us, for me, to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Stefano Markuzzi. He's a Marie Curie Fellow at the University College Dublin, an analyst in emerging challenges at the NATO Defence College Foundation in Rome, and an external fellow at Boston University. He focuses on EU-NATO cooperation in the Mediterranean, especially vis-à-vis asymmetrical threats emanating from Libya and the broader region. He is also an author of one of our recent reports that you can look up on our webpage, which is titled Terrorist and Armed Groups in the Fezzan Sahel Region, Recruitment and Communication Tactics. Stefano, welcome, and we hope to hear from you more.
Thank you very much indeed for this invitation. It is a pleasure for me to be on board today. Today's topic is extraordinarily intriguing, but also exceptionally broad. So I'll narrow it down a bit and focus on dynamics at play, especially in Libya, and more specifically in the Fezzan region, which is southern Libya. The reason for that is partly that I have stronger expertise on Libya, but more specifically that Libya has seen an unparalleled evolution of jihadi realities compared with other Northern African countries. So a number of Islamist groups mushroom across the country following the 2011 anti-Gaddafi uprisings. A territorial expansion of ISIS between 2014 and 2016, and then a more classic, if you will, example of jihadism, international jihadism epitomized by Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. And all this took place against the backdrop of the civil war between militia coalitions that has characterized, unfortunately, this almost decade of post-Gaddafi era, especially between the Government of National Accord, the GNA, established in Tripoli in 2015, and the Libyan Arab Armed Forces, the LAAF, or Libyan National Army, LNA, as it is sometimes referred to, under Khalifa Haftar. And in my first slide, I included an animated map for our audience to appreciate the evolution of those dynamics in Libya. Now, going back to terrorism, it must be stressed that Libya overall has not a history of support to radical Islam. For both historical and cultural reasons that I'm happy to discuss later on, if you will, most Libyans have always rejected radical Islam. So the significant expansion of jihadist groups in that country is both remarkable and concerning. Now, of course, this was facilitated by the weakness of the state institutions in the last, especially in the last few years. But the other reason is to be found in the notable resilience and flexibility of those groups. Now, Fezzan is the area where all these trends are epitomized. While in the northern part of the country, the territorial concentrations of jihadi groups have been essentially defeated by 2017. In Fezzan and the neighboring countries of the Sahel region, jihadi groups have adapted. They have adapted their communication tactics to the local context and even engaged in lucrative criminal activities across the Fezzan Sahel borders. So blurring the lines between jihadists and criminal networks. So we have the remnants of native Libyan extremist groups that originated in the 2011 anti-Gaddafi uprisings. The most prominent of these, still present on the ground in Fezzan, are the former Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which is close to Al-Qaeda, and the remnants of Ibrahim Shadran's petroleum facilities guards, aligned with the remnants of the defunct Benghazi Defense Brigades. Now, the interesting thing about these groups is that officially they're all disbanded. So they're not necessarily part of the political discourse or the agenda at the national or even international levels, but they're still active in the South. They might not have an umbrella, an official umbrella or an official brand anymore, but they do have the networks, they have allies, for example, in the Tebu communities, and remain connected, of course, to smuggling hubs along Libya's coastline. Then we have Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. Its main source of income has been kidnapping for ransom, a time pursued by local Fezzani groups, such as the Tuareg, a nomadic ethnic group of Berber origin, who are sometimes forced into cooperation. In other cases, they join Al-Qaeda voluntarily, as Pascal also mentioned. And the main reason found for that, at least in Libya, is that Tuareg devoutness, if you will, apparently leaves them more vulnerable to Al-Qaeda-style radicalization than other local groups or tribes. And finally, of course, we have the Islamic State. At the peak of its expansion, ISIS had a massive international recruitment campaign, mainly through the internet and through international connections. Most ISIS leaders, for example, moved into Libya from the outside. So consequently, the structure of both recruiting and staffing was internationally driven. For example, youth were targeted through the usual distribution of literature and videos, promises of guns and women. Older people would be introduced to ISIS in mosques, for example, mosques run by radical preachers or imams. And entire communities disenfranchised and marginalized following the 2011 revolution. So in this case, essentially pro-Gaddafi groups were offered the opportunity to regain some power, especially in the Sirte region. But since the ISIS defeat in 2017, recruitment strategies have changed. And ISIS is reported to now be targeting poorer communities in the south with promises of money. And also because of ISIS today geographical isolation, its international dimension is significantly weaker. Now, if you move on to my second and last slide, we can highlight a few, essentially one trend and a few components of that trend that we can see common to all of these groups that I have mentioned. And that's the development of what can be termed hybrid terrorism, which has two components. The first is the evolution of jihadi communication strategy from ideology-focused communication to one increasingly focused on material needs. So a more opportunistic recruitment, if you will. And the second component is a localization of narrative as opposed to the traditional internationally driven propaganda. Now, the first trend highlights the embeddedness of jihadi narratives and activities within regional business activities, both licit and illicit, of course. Jihadists, for example, promise material benefits, essentially, in exchange for a superficial ideological allegiance. And this is particularly true for ISIS. The second trend reveals an Africanization of jihad, including its leadership. The new jihadi narrative exploits not only local grievances, which is quite obvious, but also local political realities in Libya that can be very easily, grasped. So these new strategies are accompanied, for example, by a systematic and pragmatic policy of alliances, including through marriage, which is a trend that needs to be monitored very carefully, because it might favor, in a few years' time, it might favor the integration of jihadists into the local tribal system. And this also reveals a major difference between the Middle Eastern jihadi and the North African jihadi organizations. In the Middle East, jihadi organizations participate in bloody civil wars and are known to be extremely violent towards both the civilian population and ethnic minorities. Now, in Libya, although there were some clashes between ISIS and Al-Qaeda, these were minor, relatively minor, and primarily confined to the coastal regions. And no large-scale massacres against civilians have been documented in the south. When such events occur, they might occur, but they are exceptional. And this reveals that, those jihadi groups, even those that still claim an affiliation with their Middle Eastern counterparts, usually continue to be led and seen as local organizations in North Africa, following their own objectives and communication strategy. So I'll stop there for now, but I'm, of course, happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, there's one comment that echoes what you were also saying, and one question that I would want to ask you as well. So Patrick writes that the foundational reason why instability is spreading in the region is because the states that are systematically mishandling the lives of the vast majority of their populations, which are rural. For example, tax breaks are extended to external investors who come in with large-scale plantations, while peasants are simply kicked off their land without compensation. The net effect is a reduction in food security, livelihoods, jobs, and social cohesion, and an increase in incomes to city-based elites. Since insurgent groups offer money and power through weapons to young men, they find recruitment remarkably easy. So the question is, what should international community do to address and properly outreach audiences in Fezzan in order to counter violent extremism actors?
Yes, thank you. I do agree with the comment. That's actually the economic foundation of the problem, and the way to address it is not skyrocket science, I would say. It's investment in the region. Now, the way you invest in the region is however important, because and in this I might find myself in disagreement with some colleagues who generally approve enthusiastically any bottom-up initiative. But in order to actually make a difference with bottom-up initiatives, so with a delocalized or decentralized approach, which incidentally is what many UN agencies and the EU as well are attempting, because they see the lack of centralized institutions as a problem. But in order to influence local realities that way, you really need to invest a huge amount of money, because otherwise what you end up creating is actually group-based, so non-inclusive wealth distribution, or very easily, partly only partly solutions, short-term solutions, minor progresses that can be very easily rolled back by any local escalation. So that's point number one. We need to really address critically the perceived panacea that we sometimes tend to look for bottom-up approaches. And then a few other points for the international communities, community, of course, would be, well, first of all, avoid making the same mistakes again. This is, also for NATO member states. We saw Italy and France, for example, promoting two conflicting dialogue tracks in Kazan in 2017, which predictably turned out to be counterproductive. So suggestion number two would be, don't repeat the same mistakes. And then, of course, there is the need to follow local dynamics. And this is a tricky question because local realities can change fast. And multilateralism is a positive thing in so many respects, but it is generally pretty slow. So the risk is always there that your multilateral measures are outdated. And unfortunately, there is no easy solution to this. You need to study the local realities and engage with with area experts and local sources as much as possible. And finally, this is really about strategic communications. I mean, engage heavily in strategic communications in Libya. This holds for both NATO and the European Union. We saw both organizations suffering from a negative anti-colonial narrative that was epitomized by systematic Libyan refusals to invite peacekeepers from either organization. This needs to be addressed and possibly reversed because the lack of neutral peacekeepers or even unarmed observers has let other powers in, especially Turkey and Russia. And they brought boots on the ground that were supposed to leave Libya by the end of last month and that show no intention to go anywhere. So a huge effort must be made here to engage the so-called silent majority of Libyans and reassure them that the EU, NATO, and the Western powers, they may have made their mistakes in the past, they certainly did, but nonetheless, they really want and care for a stable, united, pacified, and prosperous Libya. I'm not sure that so many other players, Russia, for example, really want the same thing.
Thank you. Thank you. I would want to ask one question to Pascal. I think that probably the question about rural communities and aims for strategic communications is something that relates also to the Sahel region. It consists of many countries. How would you take a look at the differences between these countries, and are there kind of common narratives that could be used in efforts of countering violent extremism there?
Well, I don't think that there can be a single message or something that you can use as a standardized way to go about it, but rather a method. You have to see what the criticalities are in the country. For example, the relationship between central authorities and ethnic groups and ethnic minorities is different in every country. It's the way, for example, Niger has managed its relationship with the Tuaregs is very different from the way Mali did it. The way the Pearls, the relationship between the government in Burkina Faso and the relationship with the Pearl is completely different. However, given that we are using, military means, military deployments, programs that are more or less structured the same way, in this I agree with you, we should have the method of trying to fit as much as possible into the local environment. For example, it may well be that you have to engineer local security forces in a completely different way. It may well be that places of worship have a different role in different provinces. I think I would say rather than using a common message, I think using a common method would be good, especially because we believe that the challenge is somehow regional. But there is a local dimension, and the only thing that we can do it is by stepping up. And I agree here with Stefano. It's not a bottom-up thing. It's rather making sure that we play as a big team, with all the different actors more or less being part of an orchestra, where everybody has their own instrument, right? Let me use this metaphor, but it's actually what I mean. And if we are looking at the long term, this is how we should deal with the situation, because there is no way that we can all strictly follow a very well detailed plan for a long time. This will not happen. Also because things change really within a matter of years. But just thinking about COVID-19, right? When I worked in the region, the issues were, somehow the same, but they have evolved, right? So this is what we need to do, is trying to find out the right method and adjust it with time and places.
Thank you. Thank you for this comment. So there's a question about Libya. So can you comment on the role of NATO countries in dealing with these violent groups for their own benefit, like Libya? And maybe you can also, Stefano, talk a bit about possible political solutions to the current situation in Libya.
Yes. So the approach of NATO, so we need to distinguish between the approach of NATO as an organization and the approach of NATO nations or NATO member states. And NATO as an organization has increased its focus on counterterrorism in the last few years. We heard repeated appeals on this by President Macron, for example, stressing the need to strengthen the alliance engagement in counterterrorism. We need to remember that NATO had the only Article 5 operation in the Mediterranean until 2016 was a counterterrorism maritime operation, Active Endeavour, which was turned into Sea Guardian, the current operation, in 2016, which is a broader operation. And so NATO as an organization is trying to promote maritime awareness and situational awareness in the region. Now, a different story is the story of the engagement of individual member states that are part of NATO or the EU or both. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, in this we need to recognize and acknowledge a discrepancy between the individual approaches of individual countries. Each of them have a different view of the situation, because that view reflects their historical patterns of economic or political or diplomatic penetration and engagement with a particular region of a particular country. So, of course, the French approach, for example, is very much based on hard security. So airstrikes, go after the cells and take them on. The Italian approach has been called a molecular approach, trying to interact with the local realities, local tribes, try to forge new channels of communication. Now, I'm not saying that either of the two are per se wrong. The problem was that they were pursued in parallel with little coordination, and actually, I could say, in mutual competition. So that is where the real problem comes in. Then we had, of course, the American approach, which is also, AFRICOM is very much involved in the Sahel with occasional airstrikes. But at the same time, that was disconnected from the political engagement of the United States, following both the Obama doctrine of leading from behind and partial disengagement from hot areas. And even more so under President Trump with the relaunching of the American isolationism. And that's a problem because everything that followed is in a sense, not entirely, but is in a sense the result of a lack of an American leadership. And that tells us something about NATO. I mean, how the US, we saw it with the Libyan operation, how the US is still a fundamental actor capable of spearheading initiative within the alliance. Now, regarding the future, I think we are witnessing an unprecedented opportunity for Libya. because contrary to what happened in 2015, we had a new unity government that has received a few days ago the endorsement of the Eastern authorities in the country, which is exactly what was lacking after the Skhirat agreement. Now, this is unprecedented. It's a very positive step forward, but there are very serious concerns on the horizon. One of them I already mentioned. It's the presence of so many weapons. The countries are awash with weapons and mercenaries. Now, those mercenaries from Syria, from Russia, from Sudan, and other countries were, according to the political agreement, the Libyan political agreement approved in Geneva, were expected to leave the country to Libyans in enforcement of the ceasefire by the end of March. That has not happened. So that is both a political problem, because someone might step up and say already that there is a legitimacy issue with the political agreement not being fulfilled, and it's also a security problem. It's a military problem. So unless this problem is tackled seriously, and the role of the international community here is crucial, we have everything settled for a risk game that might escalate again into all-out war.
Thank you. Before we will be wrapping up, I would want to ask one last question to Pascal and give an opportunity to tell a bit more about your current research, or maybe a book that you're writing, and also maybe if there's someone who is listening to this webinar and wants to learn more about the region, maybe there's some reading that you would advise.
Yeah, well, the first reading that I would suggest is my report that I wrote for the Stratcom Center of Excellence. I think that pretty much covers it all. Yeah, I mean, the literature is quite vast, and I have to say it lacks some systematic approach. So you're probably giving me an input to basically start thinking about perhaps writing something that contains and addresses the crisis the way I think it should be addressed. And I think the way it should be addressed is to think about the politics first, then the strategy, and then whatever goes on in the ground, and also thinking about the other drivers that that somehow affect life in the region and affect the world as a whole. I think that I learned a lot before leaving. For example, when I started working at the Sahel before leaving, there was literally very few reports. It usually happens to me when I leave for a mission, and then I go, and then I come back and I see that there are a lot of articles being written. So generally, this happened to me in Afghanistan as well. Coming back, bookshelves were full of books about Afghanistan. Same goes for the Sahel. I think the majority of the greatest amount of materials that I can find is in French. But I think you should also scout for very interesting reports by local NGOs and by international organizations that publish these reports. I think we're still at the moment where people need to collect information the hard way rather than going to a bookshelf and actually picking something up. But thank you for the advice. I probably should start thinking about writing something on the region.
Thank you for being here, Stefano. What would be your advice, and what are you working on now?
So I'm completing my book on the EU and NATO strategies in Libya since 2011, and it should be out by October or November. I would like to have it out for the 10th anniversary of the death of Gaddafi. Now, in terms of my suggestions, of course, the report I have worked on with Jason Pack, who's one of the best experts on Libya. is on your website. Recently, I think late February, maybe the 23rd or 24th of February, a long report was published by Carnegie on North Africa, the latest report on North Africa, and that's very, very detailed and extremely interesting. So that's another reading that I would suggest very much.
Thank you for being with us and sharing your insights. So, dear listeners and dear viewers, today we talked about countering violent extremism in North Africa and Sahel region with Pascal Carlocchi and Stefano Markuzzi. The conversation showed that it is really necessary for the alliance to keep monitoring what is going on on south of its borders. And as we said in the beginning, the security of our neighbors is one and the same with our own security. And the Center will continue looking into countering violent extremism. Next week, we meet again at the same time, at the same place, and we will be talking about COVID-19 vaccine wars. We have three speakers, Alison Carher, Stanislaus Sekrieru, and Alice Ekman, and the conversation will be moderated by my Canadian colleague, Yves Desbiens. We will be actually, with this conversation, starting to kick off Riga Stratcom Dialogue. That's going to take place online, as most of the events are taking place nowadays. It's going to happen on 5th and 6th of May. We are going to announce registration hopefully by the end of this week. If you are very interested to join us and want to receive an invitation to that event, please write to us an email to info@stratcomcoe.org. Thank you for watching. See you next week and have a nice rest of the day. Thank you.